Hey, it's Al McCarn with Founded in Truth. Welcome to another edition of Current Events Simplified. This is part 4 in the World in Transition series. So let's get straight to it. Now, in this part, I want to talk about the conflict that is brewing among the three remaining superpowers, the United States, China, and Russia. Before I get there, I want to share some of my inspiration. What you see here is a chart that was first published in Spy magazine in 1989. Now, if you can see the humor in this, tournament bracket chart, then you know your history. You know how the nations have developed and the conflicts among them have proceeded over the years. In 1989, we thought that the US and the Soviet Union would go to war in a direct conflict, and that would be the end of the Cold War. And it would probably be nuclear and it would be cataclysmic. Well, thank God that did not happen. So here's where you get to the humor of this chart. Because in 1989, the Soviet Union had just pulled out of Afghanistan at the conclusion of a 10-year-long, rather dismal war in Afghanistan. The Soviets lost. Just like the United States had pulled out of Vietnam in 1972 after a rather long and dismal war, which the U.S. lost. So what that means is the U.S. and the USSR were knocked out of the championship match, and Vietnam and Afghanistan were to take their place. Kind of funny, right? Well, it would be funny if there weren't so much tragedy involved. But you see where I got the inspiration for my tournament of global domination. Now, I started the clock here in 1897 because that was the year that we had 10 great powers, nations that called the shots for all the nations of the earth. That began to change a year later when the United States defeated Spain in a war and took charge of Spain's overseas colonies. Now, 1897 was also the year that the World Zionist Organization was founded at the first Zionist Congress. That was the beginning of a multinational effort by Jewish people to return home to Israel and reestablish the covenant nation of Israel on the promised land that God had given to his chosen people. That was a dream that was realized in a generation later in 1948. Well, we move on to World War I, and at the conclusion of that conflict in 1919, there were 7 great powers. And there was a new global body called the League of Nations that was supposed to referee the other nations and be a forum where they could resolve their differences without having to go to war. Sadly, the League of Nations did not survive World War II. It was replaced by the United Nations, a more robust body. But also in the conclusion of World War I, 2 of these great powers changed flags and changed their names. The Soviet Union took the place of the Russian Empire after the Communist Revolution brought down the Russian Tsar. And in Germany in 1933, the Nazi Party took over when Adolf Hitler was elected chancellor. So the Third Reich grew in the place of Germany, the German Empire, which, well, that's another story for another video. Okay, so we get to the conclusion of 1948, and even though France and the United Kingdom remain prominent powers, they are not superpowers. The only 2 superpowers are the Soviet Union and the United States. And for the next 50 years, those 2 nations would be going at each other in a Cold War, fighting by proxies because each did not want to go to war directly with the other. At the end, 1993, the Soviet Union dissolved and there was only one power left, the United States. So what does that mean? Peace and happiness, last man standing, tournament is over. Not so fast, because over the last 25 years, the Russians have staged a comeback and the Chinese have entered the superpower status thanks to their military, economic, and cultural power. And that is what I want to talk about in this video. So where do these countries reside? You will see Russia sitting atop the world in the largest country on earth, that is by land mass. The Russian Federation extends from Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It encompasses much of the Arctic and Siberia. Problem is, there aren't that many Russians. There are like 145 million of them. So lots of territory, not many people. Well, a lot of the territory is hard to get to and impossible to live in, which is why Russia still has many, many untapped resources because you can't get to it. So, large landmass, not many people, but still a superpower. I'll explain why in a minute. China is the largest country in the world in terms of population, 1.5 billion people, comprised of nearly 60 ethnic groups. Now, the Chinese Communist Party will tell you there's only one China, one country, one culture, one language, one ethnicity, because they don't recognize minorities and have suppressed everybody else's culture, such as the Tibetans and the Shanghaiese and so on. That's both a strength and a weakness of the People's Republic of China. But also, even though they have the largest population in the world, they're crowded. You know, the United States has more land than China does, with the continental US and Alaska and Hawaii, and about a fifth of the population, 340 million people. We'll know more exactly how many after the census in this 2020 census year. But this is where the superpowers sit on the globe. Let's take a closer look at Asia, because that's where two of them reside. And you will see that Russia and China share a very long common land border, and wedged in between them is Mongolia. And that's why it's all speckled here, because, if you're wedged between two superpowers, you have to be careful with your foreign policy. This map shows you how the nations stack up in their relations with these three powers. Those in yellow, Iran and North Korea, are the friends of China. Those in reddish, pinkish are friends of Russia. These are the Central Asian and Caucasus republics of the former Soviet Union, and they still have economic, military, cultural ties with, and even political ties with, Russia. Not Georgia. They've been to war against the Russians. Georgians and Russians don't get along. Well, then we have those in blue, which are friends of the United States in one way or the other. South Korea and Japan have been U.S. allies since World War II and the Korean War. The Philippines used to be an American colony and is still a friend of America, and we've had considerable economic ties and military bases there for many years. Taiwan is the republic that was built by those who escaped from mainland China when the communists took over at the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. And then over here in the Middle East, well, the U.S. has special relations, of course, with Israel and Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states of Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. We have military bases there. We project power through those states into the Middle East and the Indian Ocean. So, they are allies of the U.S. Those who have the red and blue speckles here are in play, so to speak. Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, it's kind of obvious, and Yemen as well. They are war zones. And even though the U.S. has been involved in a war in Afghanistan since the end of 2001, been involved in war in Iraq since 2003, still have forces on the ground, those two nations are still in play. And they have considerable influence from outside, from other sources. In Iraq, it's Iran in particular. In Afghanistan, well, maybe I ought to do another video on Afghanistan, because that's another special case. Pakistan, even though they're friends of the U.S., well, they're a Muslim power, and they have their own foreign policy and their own goals, as does Turkey, which is a NATO ally of the U.S., but also, as it's a power in its own right and a Muslim power, has its own priorities and its own goals. So these nations can go either way, depending on how the world circumstances line up at any given moment, but this is how they stack up right now. Now, I could talk about Indochina here and India, but that also should be a subject of another video. Suffice it to say that the Vietnamese and the Indians do not get along with the Chinese, even though they are the big neighbor to the north, and each have fought wars with the Chinese. But the Chinese are the bully on the block, so to speak. Now, the green dot here is Hong Kong, right here, the port city on the South China Sea. I will be talking about Hong Kong later on. It is very important in this process. Okay, how do these nations vie for control? Well, they have two means of projecting their power, soft and hard. What's the soft power? The cultural influence, the ideological influence, the institutions. Institutions, yeah, like the Confucius Institutes that China has established in college campuses in the US and around the world, which put forth Chinese culture and history and worldview. Of course, a lot of it is propaganda because it's orchestrated from Beijing, and it's the Chinese Communist Party's view of the world, which is always favorable to China. What would you expect? Then there's ideology. Well, what is that? Soviet Union did this very well, promoting communist ideology and the unity of Marxists everywhere, and the laborers, the working people everywhere. That's why countries all across the world like Cuba were friends of the Soviet Union, and why Cuba and Russia still share very close economic ties, because they shared this ideology. How about culture? Hey, the US is really good at that. Let me tell you, in 2012, I was in the Philippines, and I was in the poorest of the poor sections of Manila, in the slums where people have nothing. And I was listening to Filipino children, little children, singing American pop songs in English and doing rather well at it. Tell me that's not cultural influence. Yeah, that's soft power. So what are the instruments of American soft power? Hollywood, CNN, Levi's jeans. You know, we have plenty. It's not centrally orchestrated and focused like it is on the Chinese part. But, you know, American culture is appealing. And that's a strong point we have. What about the Russians? You know what? I still love Russian culture. But since the Soviet Union fell, they haven't been able to do as well on the soft power category, but they have done well on hard power. See, hard power is easy to count. It's how many ships and tanks and airplanes you have, and how much money you have to finance them, and to finance things in other countries, and buy friends and resources and influence people. Those are easily quantifiable things. And bottom line on this, it doesn't matter how much cultural power you have. Cultural influence does not equal political power. If it's not backed up with something tangible, then it's a house of cards that will eventually come crashing down. So what does hard power look like? Well, it looks like an aircraft carrier. In this case, the USS Eisenhower and the USS Truman, two of our 11 aircraft carriers. And each of these is accompanied by surface ships and submarines to make a complete carrier battle group. And they can go anywhere in the world in a matter of days and project American power anywhere. Each of these aircraft carriers can carry up to, 75 airplanes. That's a lot. That's a lot of power. 11 of them we have, and another one under construction. What do the Chinese have? They've got two aircraft carriers, and each of them are about half the size of the Truman. And also, whereas the U.S. has been carrying out aircraft carrier operations since the 1920s, the Chinese have just been in the game for about 20 years. How about the Russians? Yeah, they got an aircraft carrier too, one, and it's broken. The bottom line here is that neither the Russian nor the Chinese Navy can stand up against the U.S. Navy. No Navy in the world can stand up against the U.S. Navy. So what do they have going for them? A lot of things. For one thing, the Chinese have the largest land army in the world, more main battle tanks than any other army in the world. That's why the U.S. and Russia don't want to go to war in China. In fact, we do not want to go to commit ourselves to a land war in Asia. That, by the way, is not just a funny line out of The Princess Bride. It is a lesson learned from hard, cold experience and bitter reality learned in Vietnam and Korea. So no, we don't want to commit forces in East Asia. There are just too many people there. And we can't project power in that way, in a lasting way, but we can project it in other ways. So each nation has its strengths. Let me tell you some of the Russian strengths, and here it is, the nuclear dimension. This is a legacy of the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union amassed vast nuclear arsenals. And even today, as you see from the chart here, they have over 6,000 warheads each. And where do the Chinese stack up on that? Right here, fourth after France, with less than 300 warheads. Now, the US and the Russians have robust triads to deliver the nuclear weapons by 3 different platforms: submarine launched ballistic missiles, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from land. US has silo-based missiles like the Minuteman you see in that picture. The Russians have, like the Topol, they are mobile. Then there are the air-launched missiles or weapons, either cruise missiles or bombs. We have the B-52 and the B-2. The Russians have the backfire bomber. This gives us global capability, each one. What do the Chinese have? Well, they've got land-based ICBMs, and they've got a few submarines that launch ballistic missiles, but nowhere near as robust as the Russian and the American nuclear capabilities. So that speaks to the difference in policies regarding nuclear weapons. For the Chinese, it is strictly a defensive deterrent. They want to make it a very expensive prospect for any nuclear opponent to launch a strike against China. They expect to survive and then launch a strike of their own, and make it a very hard-won victory or no victory at all for their adversary. Meanwhile, the US and Russia still reserve the right of first use of nuclear weapons against strategic opponents. Now, the Americans have specified only against nuclear armed opponents. The Russians do not have that specification, but the US and Russia can do offensive first strike and will do it if necessary, if there is an existential threat by a strategic opponent. China, not so much, at least not right now. So as you see from these charts, we have by warheads or by launchers, whichever way you count it, Russia, the United States far outstrips the rest of the world. China is a second-tier competitor at best. So how do these great powers come together and resolve their conflict? Not going to do it by nuclear means. We pray. China and Russia can't project power against the United States quite as well as we can project power against them, but neither Russia nor the United States wants to get bogged down in a land war in East Asia. So how do we resolve the conflict? By other means, and that's the subject of the next video. But before we get to the next video, here's homework. Hong Kong factors prominently into this equation and has been in the news. I would recommend go to Laoway86, my favorite YouTube channel with views on China. Check out this video that was just released this week. China just destroyed Hong Kong. You can find out in less than 10 minutes what's going on there, why Hong Kong is important, and have your questions answered, or at least know what questions to ask. Check this out, and it'll help you understand my video for next week. Okay, movie recommendations. Let me end with this. The Russians and the Chinese have a primary foreign policy goal, and that is security of the homeland. That's because each one has been invaded multiple times over the centuries, often existential threats. So here's Hollywood's depictions of 2 of those incidents. 55 Days at Peking tells the story of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 when the Chinese rose up against foreign intervention. How did that turn out? Well, this is Hollywood's version of how it turned out. Enemy at the Gates, I hesitated recommending this because it is so graphic and so gruesome, but it depicts the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II, one of the worst battles ever in the history of human warfare. You can see from this how the peoples of the Soviet Union suffered so greatly during that conflict, and it will give you an understanding why the primary motivation for the Russian government right now is security of the motherland. Okay, final thing. How shall we then live? I've talked a lot about power. So did Yeshua. Do you know, getting a leg up or an advantage on someone else, it's not just a nation against nation thing, it's a people against people thing. And Yeshua told us this. He told us, don't be like the nations, like the Gentiles, you know, who try to lord it over one another and rule over one another. This is the case, not just with nations, but you have seen it in businesses, you have seen it in your communities, you've probably seen it in your family as well. This is the heart of the sin problem in the human condition. It's what Yeshua came to fix. How did he come to fix it? By changing hearts and telling us and giving us the ability to be the servants of one another, and in that way, be his instruments of peace. Eventually, the nations will learn this lesson, but they're not going to learn this lesson unless people who make up nations learn it first, one heart at a time. So that's what I pray that we are all able to learn as we move forward. And that's all I have to share with you today. Come on back for the end of this series in the next video. And until then, thank you very much for watching.